No cowboy would marry the girl with a wooden leg. A widowed farmer carved her a second one. The chisel slipped that first morning and opened a gash across the heel of my left hand. I wrapped it in a rag, tied it off with my teeth, and kept working. Not because I'm tough, because I didn't know what else to do with myself once I sat down at that bench and started. That was the beginning of something I could not have named. My wife Margaret died in October of 1873. I won't go further into that than I have to. We'd been 14 years on that land together, and she knew every corner of the house and what each creak in the floor meant. And when she was gone, the silence was a different kind of thing than silence. It had a shape to it, a weight. I'd lie awake and hear her in it. The farm was 240 acres east of Sheridan, Wyoming. Barley mostly and some wheat, with a few dozen head of cattle I ran in the low pasture. The house I'd built myself when I was 31 with timber I hauled in from the ridge and Margaret hauling right alongside me. She wanted a window over the sink. I put 3. She said I was showing off and I told her no, I was practicing, and she laughed. That laugh. I'd give a lot to hear it one more time. The neighbors let me alone. That's mostly the decent thing to do when a man loses his wife. Leave him to figure out which way is up and trust him to find the door. The Beaumont family a mile to the south would send their boy Eli over now and again with something his mother cooked. I'd take it. I wasn't eating enough and I knew it, but I couldn't make myself care. I kept working, though, that I could do. Hands moving is a thing that doesn't require you to be present behind your eyes. You can grief walk through a morning of plowing, and when you look back the field is done. I won't say I was holding together. I'll say I was moving. There's a difference. It was December when I heard about Nora Delaney. You have to understand what kind of county it was. Not cruel, not exactly. Just a place where a fact is a fact and a man has to reckon with facts. And the fact about Nora, as far as most men in Clearwater County saw it, was simple. She'd lost her right leg below the knee in a wagon accident when she was 16, which made her 23 now, and she walked on a peg that had been fitted to her stump by a man in Cheyenne who did decent enough work but hadn't thought too much about the person above it. She moved with a hitch and a list to the right. She didn't complain about it, from what I heard. She just moved. Her father, Callum Delaney, ran a small dry goods store in Kinsley, the town we did our trading in. Good man, quieter than most men I'd known, with the kind of stillness in his face that usually means he's been through something and come out the other side without any bitterness left in him. He'd raised Nora and her brother Cray alone after their mother passed. Nora ran his accounts. She was better with numbers than any person I ever met, and I've met a few. What I heard about her, I heard in pieces. A man at the feed store saying she'd turned down the offer of 2 different men in the past 5 years. And the way he said it wasn't admiration, it was pity threaded with something meaner, the idea that she'd had no business turning anyone down. A man at the barber saying Callum Delaney would end up stuck with her. That kind of talk. The kind that slides in between the weather and what's for supper and doesn't notice itself for what it is. I didn't say anything. I was new to grief and not looking for arguments. But I thought about what kind of woman turns down 2 men. I met her in January. Callum was measuring out flour behind his counter, and Nora was at the ledger on the near end of it, and I came in to settle a bill and buy some coffee and some lamp oil. She was wearing a gray dress with a hem that touched the floor and you couldn't see the leg. You could hear it, just faintly, a different sound than a boot heel, when she walked across to pull a sack from the shelf behind her. A hollow knock against the floorboards twice, then quiet. She had dark brown hair pinned up loose, and her face was one of those faces that is calm without being blank. There was something watchful and dry behind her eyes, and when she looked at me it was straight on. None of the cast-down business some women did. "Mr. Ellery," she said. She'd have known my name the way anyone in a small county knows the widower who came in from the east. The 60-cent balance on the October account. That's right. She wrote it into the ledger, took my coin, wrote the receipt. Didn't rush it, didn't slow it. Her handwriting was as straight and clean as anything I'd seen. I don't know what I expected. Maybe that there'd be something broken looking about her, the way pity tends to arrange people in your head before you see them clear. There wasn't. There was just a woman doing her work, calm as river water. I said, "That peg give you trouble in the cold?" She looked up, not surprised exactly, more like she was deciding something. "Some," she said. "The fitting's not quite right, and the wood contracts." Cheyenne man. Cheyenne man. I said I was a carpenter. Not by trade, but Margaret and I had always built what we needed, and I had the bench and the tools for it. I told her there were things could be done differently in the fit that would help with the cold. I said it like I was talking about a fence post, because that's how I knew to say things. She looked at me a moment. Callum, behind her, was very busy with a bag of flour. "I'll think about it," she said. I said, "All right." I bought my coffee and lamp oil and left. She came to the farm 3 weeks later. She came alone, which surprised me. Her horse was a bay roan, 14 hands, and she managed the dismount herself. I'd been at the woodpile and I didn't go over to help, because I'd seen her face well enough in the store to know that wasn't what she'd want. I just set my axe in the block and waited. We went into the shop, a lean-to off the south side of the barn that Margaret used to call my second house. She sat on the work stool and rolled up her skirt to the knee on the right side. I looked at what was there, not to make a study of her, but because that's how you look at a problem you're trying to fix. The peg was straight-grained fir, capped at the bottom with a brass ferrule that had gone greenish. The socket cup was sewn leather, not bad work, but fitted generous and loose with too much padding stuffed in to make up the gap, and she'd worn a ring of callus and a scuff of broken skin at the stump end. "That hurts," I said. It wasn't a question. "End of the day, yes." "How long?" "Since the summer." "You should have had it seen to." "I'm having it seen to now." I looked at her then, and she had that dry thing in her eyes again, and I came as close to smiling as I'd come since Margaret. Close enough that I felt the unfamiliarity of the shape in my face. I took measurements. I used a set of calipers and a length of soft cord, and I wrote numbers on a piece of birch veneer with a pencil because paper moves on me. She was patient. She didn't flinch when I put my hands near the stump to get the taper and the angle of her natural gait. She said, "You're thorough," the way someone says it when they mean more than the word. "What wood?" she asked. I had some seasoned walnut in the back, 3 years dry, that I'd set aside for a rocking chair I was going to build Margaret and never got to. I'd looked at it a dozen times since October and not been able to touch it. "Walnut," I said. "It's tight-grained and it won't answer to cold the way fir does." She nodded. She rolled her skirt back down. I said it would take me about 2 weeks, maybe 3. She said all right. She didn't say thank you, and I was glad for it. It would have changed the register of the thing. I want to say it was simple work and I moved through it clean. That's not how it was. The first version I carved out of a roughed blank in 4 days, and when I held it up against my measurements I could see it was off at the cup. I'd overcorrected on the taper, and she'd have the same problem at the tip of the stump. I set it aside. I went back to the wood. The walnut was the most particular wood I'd ever worked. Tight, as I said, but it had grain that went its own way on the inside, and you had to find where it wanted to go before you could get where you needed it to. Margaret would have said that about people. I kept not thinking about Margaret. The second version came out of the blank in a week and a half. I got the cup right. I got the taper right. I made the socket from 3 layers of tanned elk hide stitched together with a waxed linen thread I'd gotten from Callum's store, and I fitted a leather strap that would carry the weight differently from what she'd been wearing up over the calf instead of around the knee, which was the thing the Cheyenne man had done wrong, putting all the load in one place. I shaped the foot to have a slight forward lean, the natural set of a walking foot, so she wouldn't have to compensate at the hip to keep her balance. That hip compensation was giving her that list to the right, not a problem with her, a problem with the leg. I took it inside one evening and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it in the lamp light. It was a piece of work I was proud of. Not because of what it was made of or even how it looked, though it looked fine. The walnut had come out with a dark honey grain I'd finished with linseed oil. I was proud of it because I'd solved something. Because I'd thought about another person's body moving through a day, and I'd tried to make that day easier. I hadn't felt that kind of usefulness since Margaret died. I sat there a while longer than I needed to. I sent word through Eli Beaumont's boy that the leg was ready. Nora came on a Thursday afternoon when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the cold had set hard over the flat ground between the farm and the ridge. I brought her into the shop. She sat on the stool. She took off the old peg herself and set it against the bench without ceremony, the way you set down something you've been carrying too long. The stump was wrapped in wool. She unwrapped it. I fitted the new leg. She stood up. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just walked across the shop floor to the back wall, back again. No knock. A soft tread even on both sides. She stopped and looked down at it. "The angle's different," she said. "The lean at the ankle. You were compensating for a leg that wasn't set right. I'll have to learn to walk again." "Not again, differently." She looked at me. "That's a distinction. It's an important one." She walked across the floor again. You could see her finding the balance, finding where to put her trust, the way a horse finds its footing on new ground. She went slow the first pass and faster the second, and on the third she went straight and level with no hitch in it, and she stopped at the far wall and stood there with her back to me for a moment, and her shoulders moved once. She turned around. Her face was under control. Nora Delaney was not a woman who let things show quickly or easily, but her eyes were bright and she didn't look away from me. "What do I owe you?" she said. "Nothing, Mr. Ellery." "I had the wood," I said. "I had the time." "That isn't the point, and you know it." "It is for me." She looked at me a long time. Callum had told me once offhand that Nora had a way of deciding things completely and then never coming back to them. I could see that she was deciding something now. "All right," she said, "but I'll come back." "For what?" "To see whether it holds up, and to bring you something for your supper, because Eli Beaumont's wife says you've been eating like a bird all winter and she's worried." I said I was fine. "I know you're fine," she said. "I'll come anyway." She came back the following Sunday with a pot of beef soup and a loaf of bread she'd baked herself, and she came into the kitchen and hung her coat and set the pot on the stove without asking and served us both at the table like she'd been doing it for years. We ate. We talked. Not about Margaret and not about her leg, and not about any of the things a person might expect. We talked about numbers mostly, the dry goods accounts, which were a mess Callum had gotten into through no fault of his own, just through the kind of accumulated small error that comes from not having a system. And I'd done the books for the farm since I was 19, so we talked about systems. We talked about the barley market and the weather coming, and the Beaumont boys schemed to start a chicken operation. She had opinions, sharp, practical, no trim on them. She'd say a thing and mean it, and if I said something back she'd either agree or tell me why I was wrong, and she was usually right when she said I was wrong. I didn't mind it. Most men would have. I'd been married to Margaret, who was the same kind of woman, and I'd long since learned that a woman who talks straight to you is not a problem but a gift. She left before dark. I walked her out. She mounted the roan herself, and I watched her settle into the saddle and felt the particular thing I hadn't felt since October, that the world was a place where another person was in it with you. Not alone in the way I'd been meaning when I used that word, which was more like floating than like standing. She looked down at me. "The leg's good," she said. "The ankle angle is easier than I thought it would be. Give it a month, you'll stop thinking about it." She nodded. She reined the horse around and rode out. I stood in the cold and watched until she was on the road. February she came twice. March, she came most Sundays and some Thursdays. I got used to hearing the roan in the yard. I started making sure the kitchen was decent. I don't mean I cleaned it. I mean I stopped leaving things in the disorder that a man living alone tends toward without noticing. There's a difference. We worked through Callum's accounts together and built him a system on 4 sheets of ledger paper that Nora could run without much effort. I don't know how much of that work she actually needed me for, and how much she invented to have a reason to be there. I didn't ask. In April, Craig Delaney, her brother, came to find me at the farm. He was 20, with Callum's stillness in him but something harder around the jaw. He said he wanted to understand my intentions regarding his sister. I said I was a friend to her. He said he was glad to hear it, and the way he said it meant he'd be watching. I told him to watch all he wanted. I didn't have anything to be ashamed of, and I wasn't going to pretend I did. He left. I went back to the south field and didn't think too much about it. But I thought about it enough to know what it was telling me about what I felt. I'm not going to put too fine a point on the spring, because it's my business more than it is a story and the details are mine. What I'll say is that we moved slow, both of us. Neither of us was in a rush. We were the kind of people who'd been through enough to know that rushing something doesn't make it more or make it last. She told me one evening in May why she'd turned down the 2 men before. She'd said it matter of fact, the way she said most things, sitting at my kitchen table with the lamp between us. The first man 6 years ago had brought it up on their 3rd meeting, her leg, I mean, whether it would affect having children, whether she'd be able to manage a homestead. She'd told him she thought it would be fine. He'd said he wasn't sure. She'd thanked him for his time and never spoken to him again. The second man, 2 years later, he'd never mentioned the leg. He'd been kind. But he'd done things for her that she hadn't asked for and hadn't needed, and when she tried to do things herself he'd get that look. The gentle, managing look that means a man has decided you're a lesser thing. She said she'd rather be alone than spend her life proving to someone that she was whole. She said all this looking at the lamp, not at me. I said, that makes sense to me. She looked up. I said, I didn't make you a leg because you couldn't get by without one. You'd been getting by for 7 years. I made you a better one because I could, and because the work seemed worth doing. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, I know that, that's why I kept coming back. Outside, the night frogs were going in the low ground by the creek, the first of the year, that first night chorus that means the cold is truly over. The lamp had a flicker in it from a draft somewhere. She put her hand on the table, not reaching toward me, just there. I put mine over it. We were married in June at the Kinsley Church, which is not a large building, maybe 40 people in it when it's full, and it was not quite full, but it was near. Callum Delaney shook my hand outside and didn't say a lot and didn't need to. Cray said I'd better take good care of her, and I said I intended to, and we left it at that. The reception was in the churchyard. Mrs. Beaumont had organized it, which meant there was more food than anyone could eat and music that started early and went late. Nora danced. I want to say that plainly. She danced. Not like a performance, not making a point of it, just because the music was good and she'd had a glass of something and she felt like it. And the leg I'd made her held up on the boards they'd laid over the grass, and she moved through the steps without the hitch, without the list. And I stood at the edge of it and watched and felt something I don't have a better word for than pride, not in myself for what I'd made, but in her, for what she'd done with it. She came back to me after 2 dances and took my arm and looked up at me, a little flushed, and said, You could dance, you know. I said I wasn't much of a dancer. She said, Neither was I until about an hour ago. So I danced, not well, but I danced. We moved into the farmhouse together, which we'd talked through beforehand. Nora was precise about what she needed in a house, specific, not demanding, and I rebuilt 2 shelves in the kitchen and moved the furniture in the front room so that the path between the door and the bedroom and the stove was wide and clear. Not because I thought she needed it, because a house should be made for the people in it, and that's what a man does. She brought her own things, which included a cedar chest her mother had left her, 3 good quilts, a set of books that were better than anything I owned, and the ledger system she'd built for Callum's store, because she was going to keep running his accounts from the farm, and I had no objection to it. She set up a desk in the corner of the front room by the east window, and that was her place, and I didn't put anything on it. The farm ran better. I don't mean that unkindly. I mean that 2 people thinking about the same thing, the barley yield, the cattle, the timing of the planting, when to sell and when to wait, is genuinely better than one. She caught things I missed because I was too close to them. I caught things she missed because she was new to it. We worked. The summer was a good one. That's a farmer's way of saying the sky cooperated and the ground gave what it had and the work paid off. We brought in a barley crop that was the best I'd had in 5 years, and Nora had done the accounts, and we cleared enough to rebuild the west fence entirely and still put money aside. In September, almost a year to the day from when I'd heard Margaret's name for the last time, I came in from the field in the late afternoon, and the kitchen smelled of something Nora was cooking, and there was lamplight through the window before the sun was fully down, and I stood outside for a moment on the step. I thought about Margaret. I do still. You don't stop. She was in this land, in this house, in the 3 windows over the sink, and she'll be there when I'm long gone. I don't think that's a trouble or a wrong thing. I think it's how a life works. I went inside. Nora was at the stove, her back to me. She said, without turning around, "Get your boots off before you walk on my floor." I said, "Your floor?" "Our floor," she said. "Get them off." I sat on the bench by the door and worked the first boot off and then the second, and I could hear her voice curving up toward the dry thing in it, the not-quite smile she used when I was being slow to the point. I knew that sound as well as I knew anything. She turned around, looked at me. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said, "just looking." She gave me the look that meant she knew it was more than nothing and wasn't going to press it. She turned back to the stove. I left my boots on the mat and walked over in my stocking feet and stood behind her and put my hands on her shoulders. She didn't jump. She leaned back just slightly, just the weight of her against me, and kept stirring whatever was in the pot. "Tell me something useful," she said. I told her the fence in the south corner was holding fine, and the cattle had come through the early cold without any loss. She said good. She said Callum had sent a letter about the spring order and she'd draft a response. I said all right. I said she was the best thing that had happened to me in a long time and I wanted her to know it. She was still a moment. The spoon moved. "I know," she said. "You're not bad yourself." That winter was hard. Not in a bad luck way. The farm held, the cattle held, the roof held. Hard in the weather way that Wyoming winters are, where the cold comes off the ridge like a wall and the snow piles to the window ledges, and you learn to live in a smaller circuit of the world for 3 months. We lived in that smaller circuit well. We read. We worked on the accounts, which had grown past Callum's store to include 2 other businesses in Kinsley that Nora had taken on. I built a chair, the rocking chair I'd never built for Margaret, and it came out the best piece of work I'd done, maybe in my life, and I put it by the east window and Nora sat in it in the evenings with her book. In February, she told me she was expecting. I'll say a last thing about the leg, because it's where this started and it ought to close there. She wore it every day for 19 years from the time I made it, and I rebuilt the leather socket 3 times and replaced the ferrule twice and refinished the walnut once when it had dried enough to show grain in the wrong way. Not because she asked, because I paid attention. When the children were small, we had 4, of which 3 lived past infancy and 1 did not, and I won't say more about that one except that her name was Clara and she mattered. They would ask about it. The leg. Children aren't shy about asking. Nora would explain it to them plain. There was an accident and she lost her foot, and their father made her a new one. The youngest, our son James, asked me once when he was about 6 whether it hurt to make it. I said no, it didn't hurt. I said the only hard part was getting it right. He thought about that the way a 6-year-old thinks about something, all his face working. "But you got it right," he said. I said, "Yeah, I got it right." He went back to whatever he was doing. Kids do that. They ask you the most important question you've ever been asked, and then walk away from it like it's nothing. But I thought about it for the rest of the day. I got it right. The two things I'd built in my life that I was proudest of were the house and that leg. And the house I'd built with Margaret and the leg I'd built with my own 2 hands in a cold shop in the dead of a Wyoming winter for a woman who didn't need saving, who needed a man who could look at what was actually in front of him and do something about it. I don't know why that was the thing that opened me back up after the grief shut me down. I'm not smart enough to say. I only know that the first morning I sat down at that bench with the walnut block in front of me, something in me that had gone very still and very cold started to move again. She's asleep in the chair by the window right now. The fire's low enough that I should get up and see to it, and I will, but not yet. The valley's still. The snow on the ridge catches what's left of the moon. I built this house 30 years ago with my hands and my first wife's help, and it has held up. And the woman in the chair by the window and the children who grew up under this roof are what I have to show for the years I was given. And there are men in Clearwater County who had more and spent it on less. I'll take what I have. I'll take it gladly.